Hello. So in this video, we're going to be reading Jean Rhys' short story, Let Them Call It Jazz, which is available in her collection, Tigers Are Better Looking. Now, Let Them Call It Jazz was originally published in 1960, and the reason that that is significant is because during the late 1940s and 50s, you had something called the Windrush Generation. And this was a large number of immigrants from British Caribbean colonies, because after World War II, Britain more or less reluctantly recognized that the trend worldwide was toward national liberation and that it was unlikely to be able to hold on to its colonies. And so there was, I think there was sort of official or semi-official recognition that the Caribbean colonies would become independent nations. And so while the people of these Caribbean colonies were still British citizens, many of them used their British passports to move to the United Kingdom itself, typically in search of work. And so in the late 40s and 50s, there was a big migration from the Caribbean to the United Kingdom, particularly to major cities like London. Rhys herself was an immigrant from the Caribbean, from Dominica, I think. That doesn't sound immediately right. Yeah, no, that's right. So she was born well before this, right? She was born in the 19th century. And she moved, Rhys was not African Caribbean. She was, her father was Welsh. Her mother was a Creole. So her mother was born in Dominica, but she was a descendant of Scottish ancestors. So Rhys herself was white, but in the 40s and 50s, most of the people coming over to the United Kingdom from the Caribbean colonies were African Caribbean. And that's what this story is about. Let Them Call It Jazz. And so Rhys, while she was not African Caribbean, I can imagine that she had a tremendous amount of sympathy for the experience of African Caribbean people coming to the United Kingdom, because she herself was, of course, from the Caribbean, and she had come to England. And even though she had the comparative advantage of being white and having a Welsh father who was born in the United Kingdom, she came over in the early 1900s, I think around 1906, 1910, somewhere in there. I can't remember exactly, which was not exactly a time when British people, English people in particular, were real keen on welcoming foreigners. So I can imagine that she has this sympathy for the Windrush generation and the problems that they encountered. And one of the things that Let Them Call It Jazz is really interested in is the simultaneous oppression of people of color within British society and the exploitation of the cultures themselves of people of color. I mean, in this case, Caribbean people, but you would see the same thing with, say, anti-Indian or anti-Pakistani rhetoric and violence, while simultaneously Britain co-opting things like curry, which became and still is a massive deal in British cuisine. You see the same thing with East Asians. You see the same thing across the board with Africans. Every group who has immigrated to the United Kingdom in large numbers has seen the same thing. We have the same phenomenon here in the U.S., where we, of course, systematically oppress and dispossess and overly police, etc., people of color, while at the same time co-opting elements of their culture. So, to turn to the story itself, the story is told from a first-person narrator's perspective. We never learn this narrator's name. We don't technically, I think, even learn that this narrator is African Caribbean, but we do start, but the story is told in a dialect. So this is, I'll read you the opening paragraph so you can start getting a sense of this. And the narrator's voice suggests that this is an African Caribbean author, or at the very least that this is a Caribbean author. But as we'll see, there are some reasons, I think, to assume that there is also a color issue here. So this is the opening paragraph of Let Them Call It Jazz. One bright Sunday morning in July, I have trouble with my Notting Hill landlord because he asked for a month's rent in advance. He tell me this after I lived there since winter, settling up every week without fail. I have no job at the time, and if I give the money he want, there's not much left. So I refuse. The man drunk already at that early hour, and he abused me. All talk, he can't frighten me. But his wife is a bad one. Now she walk in my room and say she must have cash. When I tell her no, she give me my suitcase one kick and it burst open. My best dress fall out, then she laugh and give another kick. She say month in advance as usual, and if I can't pay, find somewhere else. So that's not, of course, the strongest example of dialect writing or local color writing, as it's sometimes called, but it definitely gives the flavor of something like Jamaican patois or a Creole language. These languages are often have a from a standard English speaker's perspective, a non-standard dialect pattern, but they actually are standardized languages. And this is one of the really cool things about languages like patois and Creole and things like this is, speakers of standard English often think of them as simplified or dumbed down versions, but they actually exist to serve very specific purposes. They are linguistic evolutions that combine the language and some of the syntactical patterns of standard English with the language and syntactical patterns, or some of the language and syntactical patterns of African dialects, which is what a large portion of the speakers of Caribbean dialects, what their ancestors would have spoken, sometimes with indigenous language and linguistic patterns, often with French or Dutch or Spanish or other European colonial languages that were spoken widely within the Caribbean. And so what they are is an amalgamation of influences grafted onto standard English, changing and altering syntactical patterns in order to create new languages. This is, of course, what English itself is, right? Standard English is a combination of a Germanic base with a large amount of French, Norman French grafted onto it, plus borrowing from Celtic languages, borrowing from Latin, borrowing from other Scandinavian languages, borrowing from tons and tons and tons and tons of places throughout the eventual British Empire, etc., etc. And so, but what's important about this in terms of the story and important about the publication date of 1960 is that in the 50s into the 60s, the British literary establishment and British high culture did not really consider Caribbean dialects or languages to be a legitimate form of communication. They viewed them as a bastardized or Bowdlerized version of standard English, demonstrating the lower intelligence or lesser culture of Caribbean people and people of color. And it was only when you started to get Caribbean writers like Louise Bennett, like Claude McKay, like Grace Nichols, and along with that, people like Jean Rhys starting to write in dialect and creating these great literary works within Caribbean languages that people started to reassess the ability of Caribbean languages to be legitimate artistic modes. But like I said, there is reason also in this story to think that the narrator is a person of color. So the narrator gets kicked out of her initial apartment. She meets a guy who lets her stay in another apartment, but she has trouble with the neighbors because the neighbors seem to take an instant dislike to her. And what she says here is, "There's no wall here, and I can see the woman next door looking at me over the hedge. At first I say good evening, but she turn away her head, so afterwards I don't speak. A man is often with her. He wear a straw hat with a black ribbon and gold-rimmed spectacles. His suit hang on him like it's too big. He's the husband, it seems, and he stare at me worse than his wife. He stare as if I'm wild animal let loose. Once I laugh in his face because why these people have to be like that. I don't bother them. In the end, I get that I don't even give them one single glance. I have plenty other things to worry about." So this conflict with the neighbors increases, and it does seem to be very much a sort of, I recognize that some people find this offensive, but it seems to be a Karen situation, right? Where the narrator, bearing in mind that we are getting all of this told from the narrator's perspective, but the narrator is not really doing anything problematic. She sings in her garden, and the neighbors end up calling the police and basically complaining about her. And eventually she does break one of their windows because they are just publicly shouting at her and saying all this racist and anti-immigrant bullshit. And so she breaks one of their windows and ends up going to prison, to Her Majesty's prison at Holloway. His Majesty's prison in 1960, Her Majesty's prison. If this story is set in 1960. Anyway, so she goes to prison at Holloway. Not that much necessarily really happens in prison. Like she has these sort of continued reflections on how things are mostly just dull. But there is this one instance where she hears a woman singing this song, and one of the other inmates tells her that that's the Holloway song. And this is where it starts to this is where the story shifts from, hey, Britain is pretty racist, and we are very, very willing to oppress and over-police people of color, to here's a critique of the cultural appropriation. Now, to be fair here, we don't know who the singer in prison was. We don't know who the person was who sang the Holloway song initially. But when our narrator gets out of prison, she goes to she makes this friend and she goes to this party. And she meets this guy who's a musician. And what she says here, this is basically the end of the story. It's there I start whistling the Holloway song. A man comes up to me and says, "Let's hear that again." So I whistle it again. I never sing now. And he tells me, "Not bad. Clarice have an old piano somebody give her to store, and he plays the tune, jazzing it up." I say, "No, not like that. But everybody else say the way he do it is first class. Well, I think no more of this till I get a letter from him telling me he has sold the song and as I was quite a help, he encloses £5 with thanks. I read the letter and I could cry, for after all that song was all I had. I don't belong nowhere really, and I haven't money to buy my way to belonging. I don't want to either. But when that girl sang, she sang to me and she sang for me. I was there because I was meant to be there. It was meant I should hear it. This I know. Now I've let them play it wrong, and it will go from me like all the other songs, like everything. Nothing left for me at all. But I tell myself all this is foolishness. Even if they played it on trumpets, even if they played it just right, like I wanted, no walls would fall so soon. Let them call it jazz, I think, and let them play it wrong. That won't make no difference to the song I heard. I buy myself a dusty pink dress with the money. And so again, the sort of ultimate conclusion of the story is about the co-optation of the culture of people of color by mainstream white society, right? Because in the 50s into the 60s, jazz was big business in the music industry. And we don't know that this guy who has played it badly and then sold the song is a white person, a white British person, but we know that jazz, that white British people made up a major market for jazz in 1960 in the UK. That's just they were the overwhelming majority of the population of the country in 1960. And so they're the people who are going to be paying for jazz. And what we have here is basically the cultural theft of this music that our narrator had experienced within her own life, and that came from this very oppressed underclass of people, the prisoners at Holloway, and whose cultural production is now being appropriated and exploited, with one person in the chain of transmission getting £5 was not nothing in 1960. It was a reasonable amount of money. But for a successful jazz record, you would expect much more than that. And so the person who transmitted the song to the person who sells it is getting very, very little compensation, in much the same way that, for instance, the African-American musicians who inspired people like Elvis to create rock and roll often were not at all compensated, despite the massive amounts of money that people like Elvis made. And so we have this critique, and it remains an ongoing problem in Western societies in which people of color remain disproportionately oppressed and disenfranchised, while their culture fuels massive profits, often not for them.